up and he dragged it along the road to the water's edge.
Oh.
But the Japs went off his brain at one stage, and I don't know what he did to the celibate, but it took off. It just went crazy. And we never saw it again. It just charged off into the bush.
Now, talking about the Japs, do you remember the names of any of the Japs?
No, I can't remember the names of any of them. Not that I want to. But the worst one was the captain in charge of the camp, Captain Muriyama, and he finished up getting hung as a war criminal.
Yes.
But he was a real villain, and we had several members of our party who were good singers, and they used to put on little concerts and they'd sing songs, and he used to get them out and he'd line them up and he'd knock them down and he'd make them stand up and then he'd knock them all down again, and he was a villainous character.
Now, did you ever work on corduroying the road?
No,
Corduroying?
no. I worked on carrying mud, actually, not dirt, mud up on the embankment, and they'd have a bamboo pole with a rice sack strung underneath it, and they'd shovel mud into it, and because it was so wet, it just wouldn't tip off. You'd have to stagger up the slope to this embankment and upend this rice bag and shake the mud off or clay and go back and get some more.
Did you do that individually, or do you work in pairs when
Worked
you were doing
in pairs.
Yes. Yeah. Did you work with the same person? Do you remember who you worked with?
More or less. I had a friend, a really good friend named George Loveridge, and he and I were pals all the way through. And we got separated when I got dysentery at Niki and went up into Tanbaya, and he stayed with the force and they moved back down the line. But when we came home, he was a telegraphist with the Post and Telegraph Department, and he was best man at my wedding. And 6 months later, he got killed in a motorbike accident.
Could I ask you about some of the officers who were in Pond's party? Maybe start with Ben Barnett.
Well, Ben Barnett, a lot of people probably wouldn't remember. Ben Barnett was a very good cricketer, and he was a wicket keeper, and he was unfortunate enough not to be able to keep wickets for Australia, because at that time the most famous wicketkeeper was Bert Alfield, and he kept Ben out of the test team. I think he may have gone as a reserve, but Ben worked for Nicholas, the Aspro Company, and he was one of the nature's gentlemen. He and Captain Fred Starr, they maintained morale very well on the railway line.
Yes.
Very well.
Now, what about Adrian Curlewis?
Yeah, Adrian Curlewis, well, he was, of course, finished up President of the Surf Lifesaving Association of Australia, finished up Judge Sir Adrian Curlewis, and he gave a lecture in Changi before we went up on the railway line called the ABC of Crime, and he had a crime fitted to every letter of the alphabet. But the most I remember about him was when he introduced a British padre by the name of Foster Haig. And he got up and he said, "Gentlemen, may I introduce Padre Foster Haig, and what wouldn't I give for a cold glass of one and 2 fingers of the other?"
Great one. Now, and you've got up onto the line, and you've been working on embankments, and you've been working on pile driving.
Yeah.
How was it that you ended up being in hospital at Niki?
Well, I suppose in one way it was a bit self-inflicted, because during the monsoon season the Thai people used to have these yak carts, and of course they couldn't use them on the roads because it just became a river of mud. So they used to leave the yak carts on the side of the road and let the yaks go loose into the bush, and then they'd come back and pick them up in the dry season. Well, we used to go out to work and we'd set these yaks, and we decided we were going to have one of those. So we broke away from the working party. We went back and we grabbed this yak and we tied him up to a tree. And we had one chap was a wheat lumper from New South Wales, and we had a chap from Tasmania who finished up a jeweller, and he had a little pocket knife, and I think he'd worked in a butcher shop. So he said, so the wheat lumper said, "I'll fix it up." He said, "I know just how to dispatch these yaks." He said, "You just hit them between the eyes with the back of an axe head and that's it." So he took a mighty swipe at this yak and missed and knocked one of its horns off. And of course it's roaring and bellowing. It took several swipes of the axe to dispatch the yak, and then we cut it up and we took the 4 quarters off and we carried them back to camp, and we cut off big chunks of meat for ourselves and we put the rest into the cookhouse. And of course, this meat, a lot of meat on the diet we were having didn't go down too well. And the meat that was left over, we used to wrap it up and hang it up on a tree. And of course, it went off a bit. And I think that's what started me off, because I got a pretty severe attack of dysentery. And I was transferred to the next camp up the line, which was Niki. Well, there was Lower Niki and Upper Niki, and that's where I came in contact with Dr. Pete Hendry. But this was getting close to the end of the line, and the group from Burma had almost reached it, and actually the line was joined at one of our first camps, Taimata. But by that time I was in Niki, and they had actually brought engines and trucks down from Burma, so we were all loaded onto these trucks and sent up to a camp inside Burma called To Tanbaya, which was supposed to be a hospital camp. And it was actually, the people who went in there were really the sickest of the sick, who weren't capable of being sent back down the line, and that was a fairly miserable camp in which to be.
Could I just check with you?
Yeah.
Precisely how you moved into Burma? Did you go by train all the way?
Yep.
And how many were in that camp?
In Burma, Tanbaya,
Yes,
or a couple of thousand or more.
Yes, now, do you remember any of the Australian doctors who went up there?
Yes, there was Dr. Frank Cahill, Major Bruce Hunt. He was one of the leading lights in Western Australia. They performed miracles there. The experience with tropical ulcers was such that they did their best to try and save the limbs, and you've probably heard that the standard treatment used to be to hold the bloke down and scrape the thing out every day with a spoon, which was a shocking experience. But in Burma they realised that if they left it go too late, the person was already debilitated, they wouldn't be able to withstand the shock of amputation. But it was decided that they'd get in a little early, and if I remember rightly, I think they did about 96 amputations in Tanbaya, but only 4 people survived. And I was, when I recovered from the bout of dysentery, I was working as a volunteer medical orderly in a combined ulcer dysentery ward. You can imagine the combined smells of ulcers and dysentery. It wasn't a very pleasant place in which to work. But I did, on a couple of occasions, assist. Well, when I say assist, I used to hold the rice bag out to hold the leg after it was cut off, and it was then taken over to be cremated with the other bodies. But,
so this, was it Frank Cahill who was doing the amputation?
Frank Cahill did some, and I can't remember. I know there was a British doctor there too, but there were 2 or 3 doctors who
there was a Captain Emery who was a British.
Yeah.
Does that name ring a bell?
It does. One of our corporals, Corporal Scully, he was in charge of the wood gathering party at Tanbaya, and they had an old wood saw, and they used to go out and cut down these trees and bring them back to stoke the cremation pyre and the cook fires, and that was the saw they used to cut off the limbs. So it used to have to be boiled up in quality for several to sterilise it. They had a limited amount of equipment, some scalpels and some forceps, and it was fairly primitive surgery.
Yes. Now, when you went down to the Tanbaya, which is the 50-kilo camp in Burma, do you remember passing the other hospital, which was at 55 kilo?
No, that was the A-Force camp hospital. No,
Yeah.
no, we didn't. There was very, very little interchange between camps.